Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Jimenez, your host for Islam in Contemporary Life. Conversations with Professor Dr. Fathi Osman. In fact, it was Professor Osman who wrote this, quote, "Jihad is an Islamic Arabic term which is misunderstood by many people. Sometimes this misunderstanding increases through the deliberate abuse by Muslims and non-Muslims alike." End quote. Indeed, jihad is not a holy war whose aim is to spread Islam throughout the world, rather a struggle for self-improvement and a process for promoting peace and equality and justice among all mankind. For the next hour, we'll be discussing jihad with Professor Osman, of course, one of the world's well-known scholars on Islamic faith and Muslim culture. Professor, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Well, you've written, jihad is a legitimate struggle for human rights that is both misunderstood and abused. What do you mean?
Well, I mean that it is misunderstood because it is thought that it is a war to impose Islam on people by force. This is against the basic principle of Islam that no one would really be rewarded for the right faith unless he or she chooses it voluntarily and without any pressure. And any imposition of faith cannot make the person a real embracer of this faith. So it is misunderstood because it is translated into holy war, which gives the impression that it is a war to force people to be Muslims. Islam hasn't this principle that you can force people to enter paradise through their fetters and shackles. Unless they choose their faith voluntarily, they cannot be rewarded. Also, they cannot be punished for not embracing it if they do not know it or they do not choose, they do not have enough and sufficient knowledge about it and they are convinced. This is the misuse or the misunderstanding. For the abuse, yes, some Muslims might go through their own wars for worldly reasons and ambitions and greed, and they call it jihad, although it is not jihad at all. So it might be abused by Muslims, and accordingly this contributes to the misunderstanding.
Well, as you write, the main objective of jihad is to create inner and outer peace. In fact, it's not necessary for a Muslim to declare jihad to spread the faith.
No, at all, because if there is nothing to defend, if they have all their rights secure, the human rights in general, their safety, their physical safety, their moral rights and psychological rights, freedom of faith, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. If they have all these rights, there is no jihad except the inner jihad striving hard to promote their own selves. And it is jihad then against egotism, against any greed, against any selfishness. It is not a lesser jihad.
So jihad goes well beyond what the Crusades intended. How do you think the negative perception that it is a hostile and aggressive act against the West
just sticking to what is happening on the surface, not going further to what was the what were the circumstances and how they developed since a long time, and accordingly they judged very, very superficially about something which has its roots in the late history of colonialism, of relation between the Muslims and the West, and so on. So this might lead to misjudgments on both sides. On the side of Muslims, they may be suspicious about anything done by the West, and they may justify any struggle against it in any form, and by the West in interpreting every use of the word jihad as against them, and not looking it as a natural and human phenomena, a sort of reaction to a long history of colonization and subjection.
Yet it's interesting because within 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam spread from Spain to China. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I attribute this to, according to the historical development, this started from the attempt of Muslims to secure their own borders in the peninsula, in the Arabian Peninsula. And then these borders were between them and the superpowers in that time. Syria was under the Byzantine Empire, and in the east was the Sasanian, the Iranian Empire. So when they wanted to secure their borders, and these areas were populated by Arabs, and they wanted to secure them, the great powers at that time were suspicious about this, and they wanted to oppress this or suppress this from the beginning. So it happened that some mechanical development happened, the interference of the superpower against the Muslims who did not imagine at all to go beyond their borders, and their physical power cannot go beyond their borders or face great empires like the Sasanian and the Byzantine. But it happened that these people thought that it is a sort of raid like the nomad raids, and they have to oppress it, and then the clashes and the confrontations between the two sides, the Arabs, who became Muslims at that time and were Muslim Arabs, and the Sasanians and the Byzantines, and then it developed into a war against the Byzantines and the Sasanians, which was not expected and was not wanted by the Muslim Arabs at that time at all. As a matter of fact, Caliph Omar, the second caliph after the Prophet, said, I wished that there is a mountain of fire between me and our neighbors, so that we cannot jump or go beyond it to them, and they would not go beyond it to us. So they did not want war at all, but it happened.
Well, did the Prophet Muhammad in his time peacefully coexist side by side with other non-Muslim nations?
Yes, of course. In Arabia, he had Arabs who were not Muslims, Christians in the south, Jews in the south also, Christians in the east, Christians in the north, Jews in the north. So he had many faiths within the Arabian Peninsula, and of course there were the Sasanians in the east, and there were the Byzantines in the north and in the west in Egypt. And he lived with all these people without any intention to aggression. As a matter of fact, it developed in this way after the clashes happened, and it happened that there was a vacuum within these states. Their peoples, or some of their peoples, especially the Arabized peoples, did not like them, so it developed into this sort of expansion.
Well, what are the circumstances under which Muslims are permitted to go to war?
It is just self-defense. It is just defending their human rights. There is no other way. It is the only way when there is aggression against them to defend themselves against aggression.
So nothing that's aggressive, but simply defensive.
Defensive. They are not allowed to go beyond the defense at all.
How do
There
Muslims...
may be something like what we call now international justice, that when they find some people who are suffering from aggression, Muslims or non-Muslims, they may help them. That is a matter of international justice.
Professor, how do Muslims integrate jihad in their daily lives compared to, say, obligatory prayer or fasting during Ramadan or giving zakat?
I think they are training themselves not to follow their desires and whims, but to have a certain discipline in life according to certain goals and direct their lives to fulfill these goals. This sort of orientation or direction is the inner jihad that is striving hard to resist a desire for relaxation, for passiveness, for negative feelings and practices, and they have to resist this in order to fulfill the commandments and the requirements of the religion.
But as you say, if a Muslim sees wrongdoings or injustices, what is in the Quran or the teachings of the Prophet that tell them that they have to take a more active or progressive role in that regard?
The Muslim is required always, in addition to self-corrections, to correct anything wrong in the society, to speak up. And this is something called, according to the terminology of the Quran, enjoining the doing of what is right and forbidding the doing of what is wrong. Every Muslim is required to do this with regard to his own self first, with regard to his family, to his close friends, to the community, to the whole society, to the state, to the authorities, the rulers. He is supposed to speak up when something wrong happens. And as a matter of fact, this is required even in training children, that the child himself should be educated to speak up when anything wrong happens, even within his family or his school or whatever, in a decent way, in a polite way, but he or she should do this. So they are supposed not to be passive towards anything wrong that happens. And of course, this may develop into a sort of confrontation, and in this case, it is a confrontation in opinions, in discussion, in something like this, but they are not allowed to use any force unless for self-defense, except for self-defense.
Right. How did the different forms of jihad and Islamic activism, though, manifest themselves historically between the second half of the 19th century and the second half of the 20th century? And I'm really talking about a period when most of the Muslim world fell victim to European colonialism.
Well, I think in that time it was legitimate for Muslims to defend themselves. Of course, they were weak, militarily speaking, politically speaking, economically speaking, but they tried to do their best in fighting these colonial powers, mobilize the people against these powers, and in this case, I think whenever Muslims lived with non-Muslims in the same area, the non-Muslims participated with them, and they had a joint front against these colonial aggressors. And the religious leaders, of course, mobilized the masses, and they reminded them that it is their religious duty to fight these aggressors. So this is jihad worked very well, and of course this also contributed to the fact that the West knew or first met jihad as a confrontation against the West.